No, 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 no. Bloody stormy all day. Stormy weather. Clouds up in the sky. Oh, words like that. I don't know why. La la la. Right, here we are. We've done a bit of inspection of the fencing and the stock. You know, this time of year, if it's really windy, like you have storms like we had last night, you check your boundaries for trees falling onto the fences, because if a fence gets blown over or broken from a falling tree, then the stock can get out, you know, and then they go wandering in the national park and you lose them, or you know, they wander on the roads. And generally speaking, it's good to keep your stock inside the fences. As you might be able to see, I've got a herd of dairy cattle sitting there conveniently behind fences, and so there's nothing for me to do here other than drive back home again. 80 series Landcruiser. What's it like to own one of these things? Well, I've had this thing for over a year now. I've done a couple of services on it. The maintenance that's been required on it is absolutely minimal, which is pretty well true to the Toyota reputation. This was a good vehicle to start with a good service history. It's always been regularly serviced. What I need to do to this in the last year or two is oil changes. It really likes new fuel filters. I've discovered I collect a bit of water in my fuel filters, which is not a good recommendation for the local fuel supplier, you know, because he's given me water in my fuel. But nonetheless, I've got good filtration on this, and it likes to have the filters changed. So I do that at every oil change, rather than the Toyota manual and the Haynes service manual recommend a fuel filter change every second oil change, but I do it every oil change just to make sure I've got clean fuel going in the engine. Very important in diesel. Air cleaner. Yeah, it was dirty. This is not a particularly dusty area because I'm on the coast. We've got sand here more than fine dust, but nonetheless, I really appreciated having a new air filter put in. So I don't do that every oil change. I do that every second oil change. Every oil change, I take it out and just give it a blowout with some compressed air. And she really appreciates that. She runs a bit smoother after a service. It might be by imagination, but it seems to use a little bit less petrol after I've done the fuel filter and oil air filter. And put a bit of fresh oil in and filters there, you know. Other maintenance that I've had to do to this, just regular stuff like the handbrake cable needed adjustment. You've got grease nipples on these universal joints on the drive shafts here, and also on the steering column, you know, where it joins the steering box. There's a grease nipple on a little universal joint and gizmo there. And just over the vehicle, there's a few grease points, which you see. I've got a little, you know, mechanic's trolley. I'll just crawl underneath it, have a look around. Anything that looks like a grease nipple, give it a bit of clean off and whack some grease in there. I've changed the diff and transfer case and gearbox oil, basically because I don't know that what the previous owner did, even though she was getting it serviced regularly by Toyota. That's not a great source of comfort to me in particular, but the oils are all clean. Now, something you get in 80 series Landcruisers, a bit common to vehicles that have got solid front axles, independent suspension but solid front axle, and the Burfield joints, like a CV joint it is, and the front differential runs in grease. So the diff centre runs in oil. You know, this one's got a locking diff in the centre on the front. But between the Burfield joint area and the differential area, there's a seal to stop the grease getting into the oil and the oil getting in the grease. And as these things get older, you can get cross-contamination, which actually starts to introduce a bit of wear, particularly into the Burfield joints. So it's a good exercise to change the differential oil on the front axle so you can see if there's any grease contamination in it, which you notice because it's a bit murky and, you know, not like oil. It's got grease in it. But it was clean, so not a problem in this vehicle, you know. Fully standard, leave it that way. Heavy duty this, heavy duty that, yeah, bullshit. the engineers in the factory knew what they were doing. Maintenance wise, oh yeah, this has got a squeaky thrust bearing. I thought, you know, it's when you sit there it just makes a little squeak. It's not exactly bad. It can get a little annoying if you know it's there. When you put your foot in the clutch it goes away, so you assume thrust bearing. But after I've owned the vehicle for a while now, I realise it's probably the spigot bearing, the little bearing that the drive shaft sits into in the flywheel. Very small thing. And I was looking back through the service history of the vehicle from the previous owner, and I noticed 8 years ago they noted this little noise. So it's been doing it for 8 years. The clutch works perfectly, there's no judder in it, there's plenty of meat in it, you know. Clutch height is within standard specs and all that kind of stuff. So I'm going to pull the gearbox out later this year and do that, even though the clutch doesn't need replacing at this stage, because it's just a little annoying to have a squeak in it. I want the thing perfect. But the other thing is that the clutch, I'm not sure whether it's been replaced before or not. But if you replace the clutch before it actually starts to slip and that sort of thing, you probably don't need to get the flywheel machined. The problem with getting a flywheel machined, which is common practice now, is that it can affect the height of your clutch pedal, you know, and the way the clutch travel works, because you're changing the geometry inside the bell housing. It doesn't occur that way in all vehicles, but it does make a difference. So the other thing is it lightens the flywheel a bit, which is not particularly a great idea with a mechanically injected diesel engine. So a little bit of a squeak in there, which is a little bit of a pain in the neck, but on the other hand, $600 for a clutch plate that it doesn't need, but I'm going to do it when I'm in the mood. So really, for a vehicle that was built 25 years ago, it's in incredibly good condition. Now, as far as age of the vehicle, when these vehicles were built, they were very expensive. This was delivered at $58,000 new in 1996. And at that time, you could buy a standard family sedan for about $15,000, I think. Yeah, I seem to remember buying one back then. So it's around about 3 to 4 times the price of an average sedan car of the time, you know, a 6-cylinder sedan car. So they were a bit of an upmarket vehicle at that time. So things like electric windows, central locking, and all that stuff, that's on here, you know, all the immobiliser system, all that came with the vehicle, which is, I mean, it's pretty standard on modern vehicles of any price range now. So it's comforting to have those things already on the vehicle. This is a GXL, so you get the slightly better specification package. I don't know about the other model variants. I haven't studied into it that far. Something I've found that's actually rather handy with the entertainment system. I've got the standard Toyota CD and radio in it. It's also got a cassette player in it, you know. Got very good speakers in it, although I'm going to upgrade the rear speakers for a bit more bass, I think, you know. Got plenty of amplification in it without any distortion. It's quite a good unit, you know. I think they're made by Pioneer for Toyota by the look of it, you know. I used to own a couple of, you know, a chain of car radio shops, and it has a sort of familiar look to it, and the chassis on the back. The cassette player means that I can put an insert in there that I can adapt an MP3 player. You know, you get a thing that looks like a cassette, you push it in there and you can plug in your MP3 player because it's got a cassette player in it, you know. So because it's older technology, ironically, I can use the latest technology. I can use MP3s in here, and of course MP3 is actually much better if you're going along bush bashing, because you're not like a CD. It can shift around, you know, jump tracks and so on if you're doing particularly rough track work. MP3, yeah, it's perfect all the time. And also you can carry a lot more music on your little MP3 player or your mobile phone, you know. That's handy to have. This has got twin tanks, which is something I've had on quite a few vehicles, but I always find it to be the greatest thing since sliced bread if you live out here in the country. This one has got a separate fuel gauge for each tank. There's the main fuel tank, the fuel gauge is on the dashboard, and the secondary fuel tank, the fuel gauge is in this overhead console along with an altimeter, which is surprisingly handy, you know, if you happen to be in mountainous countryside. Because it's got separate fuel gauges, I can see everything that's happening as far as fuel, and I like to keep the second tank topped up, even though that means I'm carrying an extra 40 or 50 kilograms around. Because if you've got a lot of fuel in the tank, you get less condensation because there's less air above the fuel, and that keeps a bit of water out of the fuel. Generally speaking, it's nice to have twin tanks anyway, just for the security if you're going off-road, and also if you're travelling long distances here in Australia. You're not sure of the quality of fuel supply out in the country. But because it's got separate fuel gauges, I can see the fuel level in each tank, which you couldn't see when you have a Land Rover. You know, I've had quite a few Land Rover Defenders, ex-Army ones and all sorts of carry-on. And with them, when you switch the tank over, at least the Land Rovers I had, when you switch the tanks over, then the fuel gauge tells you the level in the other tank, but you can't see the level in the other tank until you switched over with those Land Rovers that I've had. So it's very handy to have the two gauges, and there's just a nice electric switch here you use to switch from one tank to the other. There's no procedure to learn or anything. Some vehicles, like I had a Land Rover that had a mechanical valve, you know, quite an amazing piece of valving technology. But if you didn't get the procedure right, you could get airlocks, which were very inconvenient. It got me caught in the Simpson Desert once. But this is a very straightforward, well sorted out, well designed system. Works well. The twin batteries, I've actually sort of improved the system a bit. I've got an auto electrician to wire in a few extra gizmos to put a deep cycle battery in a second battery for running the fridge when I go fishing, you know, for all the big fish I catch. I've got some switching here to alter the way it charges the second battery and blah blah blah. But having the ability to start the vehicle on either battery is very comforting. I haven't had to do it yet, you know, but it's nice to know you've got it there, you know, when you get into a remote area, if you're on your own particularly, but at any time really, just knowing you've got a backup is a very comforting feeling. And I guess that's really what the Landcruiser is about. It's actually a very comforting feeling to own one of these when you go off-road. My nephew came up here, he's got a Ford, is it a Ranger? The new four-wheel drive dual cab pickup thing they've got. Same as the Mazda BT50 or 40, whatever it is. And we were going along a track which is very rough, you know, rock strewn, very, very rough track. Not sail here at Tom Rocks, and we were about 15 kilometres along it, and he stopped and got out and he said, "That's it, I'm going back." And he turned around and made his way back because he felt the track was just too rough. His vehicle felt like it was smashing the vehicle to pieces. And the Landcruiser, on the other hand, these are a rugged thing, and it's got beautifully sorted out suspension, and it didn't feel like that in this vehicle. It just feels tough, you know. That's a possible difference between this sort of more basic kind of technology. This has got limited slip diff on the rear, and it's got a locking differential on the front, which is operated from this button here on the dashboard. This works extremely well. I think, as far as I know, every Landcruiser you get will at least have the limited slip diff on the rear, which makes them much more capable off-road than a standard Land Rover of the same period, because Land Rovers didn't come with a limited slip diff on the back normally. So they're always very good in sand and that sort of thing. They've got better traction because of the limited slip diff in the back. With the extra diff locking on the front, well, the only real limit is how stupid you are or aren't, you know. So, great thing to own. This is going on for a while. Can you tell I actually like my Landcruiser?